There are not many older classic gaming franchises these days that haven't been ruined to some extent by cash grabs and trying to appeal to modern gaming audiences. Deus Ex is one of the few of them I can think of where that just hasn't really happened. The original Deus Ex, released in 2000, it is a classic, it is one of the best immersive sims of all time, and even when it was rebooted, it was still doing pretty well under Eidos Montreal. We had Human Revolution, pretty decent game, it's fun, I've played it through a couple of times, it's always nice to go back to. Mankind Divided, which still has great gameplay. It was unfortunately sabotaged supposedly by Square Enix, who wanted to get it out quickly so they could start work on a sequel. They wanted it to be sequel bait, essentially. It was like half a game, release it for full price and work on the next one. Because they did that, word of mouth on Mankind Divided wasn't great, and despite being pretty good, the moment-to-moment gameplay, it didn't sell well. The series was put on ice. So Deus Ex, it's had good entries, it just unfortunately basically died out, and it's kind of sad because the same things pretty much happen to other similar series these days, like Dishonored. We had 1 and 2, we got sort of the big expansion DLC, and then that was put on ice as well. The studio behind it is now working on a Blade game, so immersive sims haven't been in the greatest of places. That is until now though, because there is a rumour floating around suggesting that there is going to be a remake of the original Deus Ex, so that 2000 release, and that is with JC Denton, the original main character, so not Adam Jensen, who we got in the Square Enix games, the Eidos Montreal games. So it's a remake of the original, supposedly. This is a 4chan rumour. Now that means there's basically no real source. It could be a load of crap, but it's fun to speculate on, and occasionally you strike gold and one of these rumours ends up being true. So you never know. And I will say as well, Deus Ex hasn't always been perfect. The follow-up to the original was actually Invisible War, which wasn't seen as that great. But compared to some games today, it's not the worst. It was just following up the original Deus Ex. It definitely missed the mark. But this remake, the leaker says there's a Deus Ex remake in development. The pig is not related, it's just random. It is not being made by Eidos Montreal. It is using Unreal Engine 5, and the Jensen games have been scrapped. Now again, there's no source, but I think what's mentioned here, it's all pretty sound. I mean, it's not amazing information that no one could just make up, but if you're talking about common sense, I could believe all of that. If this was an official announcement, I'd sort of go, yeah, even though some of it might be disappointing, it kind of makes sense. And starting off, it not being made by Eidos Montreal, that's a little bit questionable because Deus Ex, it's such a phenomenal game that the systems within it, the way it was made, nothing has really matched it since. It does so many things very well. You can play it as somewhat of a stealth game. You can play it as a bit of a shooter. It's got all those immersive sim elements in it. There is so much, and it makes me think that I've got to reinstall it actually and give it another play. But trying to remake that, if it is genuinely modern graphics, it's genuinely like a AAA game, Deus Ex again, all the same design, just AAA visuals, that is going to be extremely hard to do, to replicate all those old mechanics and bring them all into a modern engine. This would take years and years. It's not some sort of quick win if they're going to do it properly. So it is a massive, humongous undertaking, and that in itself makes it kind of skeptical. But if they can nail it, it would absolutely be a huge win. Now, I don't think this is just going to be sort of a minor remaster or anything like that, because it does mention it's being made in Unreal 5. Just on Eidos Montreal not making it, keep in mind that the Deus Ex IP, it's actually owned by Embracer Group, THQ Nordic, whatever you sort of know it as. That is that huge conglomerate who has been shutting down studios left and right. They're basically going bankrupt. They had a huge billion-dollar deal fall through that was going to prop them up, and since that fell over, they have basically just been shutting down anything that's not guaranteed to print money. They shut down the studio behind Saints Row, Time Splitters. Also, the original Gothic studio's not in a great place. There's talk of that being shut down as well, Piranha Bytes. So they are moving on basically anything that they don't think is like a surefire win. Now, the good news is Eidos Montreal, the original Deus Ex studio, they've made the Thief remake, which wasn't actually great. I'll address that towards the end. They did Guardians of the Galaxy most recently, and while I don't really care about superhero games, I've heard it's pretty well made, so they haven't really come up with too many duds. They're a pretty well-working, well-oiled machine, so hopefully that means that Embracer Group knows that, and they just let them keep doing their thing. They don't ruin a studio that's doing pretty well and has that potential to make some money for them, and more importantly, make some good games. Now, I bring this up because Embracer owns both Eidos Montreal and they own the Deus Ex IP, so it's kind of like, well, why aren't they working on the remake? But there is actually some precedent to this, because I mentioned that Embracer owns Piranha Bytes, who created and made the Gothic games. Gothic 1 and 2, fantastic older open-world RPGs from the early 2000s. However, a Gothic remake is in production, but it's not by the original studio who makes it. So again, Piranha Bytes, who Embracer owns. So the short of that is, Embracer has one of their other studios making a Gothic remake, while the actual studio who created Gothic is working on potentially something completely different. So this has happened before, so the fact that the Deus Ex remake might be being made by someone else, it could be a possibility. This might not be bullshit. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that Eidos Montreal are apparently working on a new Deus Ex project. There's been rumours that have floated around for ages. Jason Schreier is a bit of a clown video game journalist. I'm not always a fan, but he's genuinely reliable. His work is solid. And he put out the rumour that Eidos Montreal are working on a brand new Deus Ex. It's going to be years away. I think the rumour was from 2 or so years ago. Maybe some work's being done on it. But he put that out there. So it's probably reliable, which means we could be getting a Deus Ex remake, perhaps a new one down the track as well. But again, a Deus Ex remake would be such a big undertaking. I'm sure it would take years, so I'll be curious how long it takes, and the leaker actually goes into that, so we'll find out more in a second. The last bit here, Jensen games have been scrapped. Now, that will make some people quite sad, because JC Denton, the main character from the first Deus Ex, now, he's iconic in some ways, but he probably doesn't have the same personality as like an Adam Jensen, who you stepped into his shoes, you played as him across multiple games. Many people were introduced to the franchise by those Eidos Montreal games with Adam Jensen in them, and then they might have gone back and played the original because they loved them so much. I think a lot of people are in that boat. So those people are going to be very disappointed if they just move on from Jensen. Because as I mentioned earlier, Square Enix forced Eidos Montreal to rush the latest Deus Ex game, Mankind Divided, out the door before the series was really finished. It did finish on a cliffhanger, so people didn't really get to enjoy the rest of that story. People have been waited nearly 10 years for the follow-up, at least some sort of conclusion to Adam Jensen. And if these rumours are to be believed, then that's not happening. The Jensen games have been scrapped. So some people will be sad. I mentioned, though, that I understand all of this, and I would think that this makes sense. And this kind of does, because Mankind Divided, it didn't sell that well. The publisher might be scared. They might be thinking, well, if people have to go back and play these older ones, and they didn't sell well, what are the chances this new one does gangbusters? It's probably not a high likelihood. So they may just want them to start absolutely from scratch. And look, I'm okay with that. I think there's always the chance that they could put some Easter eggs, or even a proper, say, side quest part of the story that does manage to tie up Adam Jensen without him actually being the main character. The brand new Deus Ex that we might get, it could not only tie off the Jensen storyline, but maybe that new game is a proper follow-up to the original Deus Ex, and that would make sense if we get a Deus Ex remake and then we get a brand new game down the track. It would kind of make sense that it is a follow-up to the original, given that will be the latest entry in the series that perhaps more people have played. So I think this could work out. You get the remake, we get a new game, and then the new game ties up Adam Jensen so that the series can move forward. There is a little bit more here, so that leaker has one more post where he says the original Deus Ex was created in Unreal Engine 1, and that's just something to point out because the remake may be being made in Unreal Engine 5. The original was made on the original Unreal Engine, number 1. He mentions, I forgot to add in the original post that Eidos Montreal is working on a new Deus Ex game, so he backs that up. Now, once again, there's no source here, and this is probably the first thing I questioned, which was, it seems maybe not super likely that someone who was aware of the Deus Ex remake would also have heaps of knowledge of what Eidos Montreal are doing, because if there are different studios, who is this person? You would assume to be privy to all of this information, they'd have to be at like Embracer head office. They probably couldn't just be an employee at one of these studios, otherwise it doesn't make a lot of sense they'd know all of the inner workings, but maybe they are sharing information, maybe there is some collaboration, and if the new Deus Ex game from Eidos Montreal, if that has quite a bit to do with the original game, maybe it makes sense that they're all in the know. So there's maybe a question mark on if this adds or maybe removes some credibility. I guess we'll find out one day if it's total shite or if it has some credibility. He continues, the remake is set to be announced and released within the next year and a half, since it is pretty late in development. That's quite interesting to me, because when I first saw this, I assumed it was a very recent decision to remake the original Deus Ex, because there's no guarantee that this IP is really going to take off again. It's probably never been the biggest seller. Human Revolution did reasonably well, which is why it got a sequel, but then it just sort of fell off, and Square Enix had absolutely no interest in it. They preferred to chase NFTs in gaming. That's kind of why they sold the Deus Ex studio and the Tomb Raider one as well. They wanted to do NFTs, good luck with that. But I would have assumed that Embracer, the publisher, would have waited until there was at least one Deus Ex game that was ready to go. Maybe Eidos Montreal's new one, get that out the door before they committed to making multiple games by multiple studios, because they'd want to see if this is really worth investing in. But when I think about it, Cyberpunk came out a few years ago, and the hype was enormous. Even before that came out, yeah, it's not truly an original IP, but it kind of is within the gaming sphere. A lot of people don't know about the tabletop game. So perhaps it is that the hype was just so massive that maybe Embracer greenlit this remake around that time, because they were caught up in the hype as well. They thought this game is huge, it's going to be selling tens of millions of copies, we want to get in on it. I was thinking around that time that even Square Enix were probably disappointed, because they sold off these studios. Can't remember if it was before or after that, but they obviously stopped Eidos Montreal from working on Deus Ex. They moved them on to Marvel projects, and they must have been thinking, did we miss a trick there? Because this game is going gangbusters and we've got nothing. We've got Marvel's Avengers, which did about as well as I expect the Suicide Squad game to do, which is not very well. So Square Enix, they completely missed out there. They've proven themselves just totally incompetent with anything to do with Western developers for a long time anyway. As bad as Embracer Group have been with all these shutdowns, the way that they manage things, they're probably still not as bad as Square Enix were at that time with what they were doing with Crystal Dynamics, Eidos Montreal, the Hitman studio. That was a total joke. So I can only pray that Embracer Group doesn't completely fall over and these Deus Ex games get cancelled, because that would be very sad. He ends here, the leaker, by saying you should be getting a trailer and announcement around March. That is super soon. That's like 5-6 weeks away. So at least we'll kind of know soon if this leak is total garbage or not. We don't have to stay excited for years and then get disappointed. We can know in a couple of months. Montreal's Deus Ex game, which I don't know much about, will be releasing much later. And that lines up with what Jason Schreier said, that it was years and years away. They'd pretty much just started around the time he leaked it, which was a year or two ago. But the other thing to mention is a while back, earlier in 2023, some rumors did go around about Eidos Montreal's sort of other games. It could be Deus Ex related, it might be another game. For instance, we see here they are working on a new IP that sounds similar to Tomb Raider, but influenced by Breath of the Wild. It's going to be open world, it says here. These are job listings, by the way. That's how this rumor started. They put up a few ads, and they suggested that they are making a Tomb Raider-like, Breath of the Wild-like, but it's going to be open world. So, I mean, I'm not super pumped by that. Eidos Montreal make pretty well-made games, but there's enough of these sort of open-worldy titles, Assassin's Creed and things, and I'm sure this studio would do a much better job than Ubisoft does on these style of games, but I want something unique. Deus Ex is super unique. There is very little like it. Even if you enjoy Cyberpunk, if you haven't played like the original Deus Ex, it is a different beast. It's incredible. So much you can do. It's sort of the king of the immersive sim, in my opinion. It does everything so well. Outside of that, the only kind of bad piece of news I've seen relates to another job listing from last year, and this is around the time people were discussing a potential new Deus Ex. The job listing mentioned has experience in working on co-op games. Now, I said at the very start of this video that Deus Ex hasn't really been butchered. They haven't totally stuffed it up yet. if there is a focus on co-op multiplayer in a brand new game, that is where I'd start to question things. If it's just like a side feature and the publisher has made them put it in, multiplayer games of the future, you can't ignore it. If it's something like that, I could live with it. I mean, Baldur's Gate 3, it's obviously more co-op friendly in that you control a party, but that game obviously hasn't been ruined by multiplayer. But with Deus Ex, I would question it. It's a very single-player focused experience. You're stepping into the shoes of the main character. I'm not really sure how that would work. Now again, this might not be related to Deus Ex, because Eidos Montreal have a history of working on more than one game at a time. I mentioned that Tomb Raider-like, Breath of the Wild-like that they might be making. Maybe this co-op stuff relates to that, and that would kind of make more sense. I can hope anyway. Maybe I'm coping, we have to see. But if we do look at Eidos Montreal's history of games, they've never actually gone more than 3 years without releasing something major. So we can see back in 2011, they released Human Revolution. They followed it up with The Thief remake, which wasn't great. It's kind of funny. I feel that they nailed it with Human Revolution. It is a different game to the original Deus Ex in some ways, but I think they did a fantastic job of reviving the IP. Maybe not everyone agrees with that, but I think that's a pretty common opinion. But with Thief, they kind of dropped the ball. It is not as good as the Middle Age, the Dark Project, the original Thief games. It just feels like they were trying to bring it to modern audiences. They tried to make it more mainstream. It didn't work. They alienated original fans, and no one else was really interested either. So they botched it, and that series is certainly dead, it looks like, for the moment. But 2014 to 2016, 2-year gap, and we got Mankind Divided. So we can see here a 3-year gap, then a 2-year gap. We then got Shadow of the Tomb Raider 2 years later. The Avengers, less said about that, the better, but it was 2 years later. And then the Guardians of the Galaxy 1 year later. So we're in 2024 now, and Eidos Montreal have never gone over 3 years between releasing games. From what I see here, it seems really obvious that they work on more than one project at once. So it's very likely they could have that new IP in the works, plus Deus Ex, which means we could see a game released from them maybe at the end of this year, and then the new Deus Ex maybe in 2 or 3 years or something like that. Obviously, modern video games, it seems like they always take longer and longer, so this rule isn't really set in stone. We can probably tear up those rules in 2024, but I would say next year at the very latest for another game from them. If they're working on 2 projects, I don't think they're going to go sort of 4, 5+ years without releasing something, especially with Embracer's financials. I think they'll be expecting something. They'll be relying on this studio because they've produced the goods in the past. So we'll have to see, but this rumor, if it's true, it's something to get excited about, but also a bit skeptical. You could easily stuff this up, get this completely wrong, but at least we've got the original to go back to, and maybe it's time to reinstall it. I might look into that, but thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers, bye.